G'day guys, and welcome to this business management lesson. In today's lesson, we're looking at key knowledge point 326. That is Unit 3, Area of Study 2, and the sixth key knowledge point for this area of study. Today specifically, we're looking at performance management strategies. And helpfully, this key knowledge point tells us which performance management strategies we need to talk about. When we're talking about performance management, we're talking about strategies used to evaluate employee performance against a predetermined standard, and then whatever needs to be done in response to that evaluation. Perhaps the employee needs to be rewarded for their good performance, meeting or exceeding a predetermined standard, or perhaps they're not meeting the standard and corrective action needs to be implemented, something like training, for example. Individual objectives are set for employees to describe, or certainly to inform the employee, what they're expected to do. This is all part of performance management. It's really important in a well-managed business with well-managed staff that the individual objectives are deliberately set so that employee efforts will drive the business towards the achievement of overall business objectives. And really, the only way to make sure that's happening is to be really deliberate when you're setting employees' individual objectives so that those employees are working to drive the business in the right direction. There are a number of performance management strategies that exist out there, but the study design tells us we need to look specifically at management by objectives, or MBO, appraisals, self-evaluation, and employee observation. Management by objectives has a lot of similarities to all of the good things we talked about when we talked about goal-setting theory. In management by objectives as a performance management strategy, business goals are set, and we know what we want to achieve with our business. Then, collaborative individual goal setting occurs. The manager and the employee will sit down and together work out what it is that employee wants to achieve, and the manager will also be involved in that process, particularly to ensure that the individual goals are aligned with the business goals. Performance of that employee is regularly monitored against the individual objective, and feedback will be provided. This should all be sounding very familiar to you. Certainly, where the employee's performance meet or exceeds the predetermined standard, you want to reward your employee for that. And in the event that the employee's performance is found to be lacking in one way or another, the manager can implement corrective action to assist the employee to better meet their individual objectives in future. At that time, you would evaluate your business objectives. Have they been met? Are they still things that you want to achieve with your business? Has the business context changed dramatically and we need to reevaluate our business objectives? If not, look at our individual objectives. Have they been achieved? Is the context different now? Do the employees need to be focused in a different area? And so on and so on. MBO describes a cyclical and an ongoing strategy. Definitely, if an employee exists within an environment where management by objectives is done well and done right, we can expect that our employees are by and large going to be working in such a way that drives the business towards the achievement of business objectives, that employees are going to feel motivated. They've got these collaborative goals set and they're getting regular feedback. And we know from goal setting theory that those are two key features of most motivating goals. And definitely, these employees are going to be improving their skills and knowledge all the time, certainly as a result of implementation of corrective action if they're not meeting the standard in the first place. And definitely, these employees are going to be getting better and more able to meet and exceed their individual objectives as a regular feature of working in the business. Management by objectives works as a strategy to manage the performance of your employees. Performance appraisal is a little bit different. A performance appraisal is largely where the manager sits down with an employee and provides feedback and develops objectives. But this is not a cyclical process necessarily. It doesn't necessarily follow all of those steps in order like management by objectives does. But it does allow a manager to provide key feedback on performance at a set interval. In many institutions, in many businesses, appraisals are something that occur once a year, where a manager will sit down with the employee and provide feedback on the last year's business. And definitely these appraisals or these evaluations can be used to determine promotions, who is worthy, who has earned access to a career advancement opportunity, or perhaps these appraisals will identify employees whose performance has been consistently lacking for a reasonable period of time. In the event that that is the case, the employee might need training. The business might need to invest in training for that employee, or certainly if the employee has been significantly underperforming, perhaps that's cause for sanction, demotion, or perhaps even termination of that employee's employment. Evaluations do work in that if an employee has been performing well, if their work has met or exceeded predetermined standards, at the time of evaluation, the employee can be rewarded for that. Certainly where the employees are found to be lacking, corrective action can be taken. But typically, as this is a less regular event, more sporadic, or certainly greater lengths of time pass between evaluations, we typically look at performance appraisal as being less effective than management by objectives. But certainly one advantage is because it doesn't happen as often, it takes a lot less time. And in business, perhaps the availability of your managers to be performing constant appraisal and feedback through the MBO strategy might be something that you need to look at as to determine whether or not you'll do quarterly or annual or even biannual appraisals rather than something cyclical and ongoing like MBO. Self-evaluations are another strategy you might use to assess your employees. Certainly takes a lot less time than any of the previous two strategies because your manager doesn't have to be collecting evidence and observing and looking at performance necessarily. That's where you make that one of the employee's duties. And the employee is invited to assess their own performance against predetermined standards. Then the manager and the employee will engage in a dialogue. They'll sit down for a chat where the employee can report on their self-evaluation, and the manager and the employee can work together to implement training where the employee feels it would be most beneficial, or perhaps the employee has reported that they're fantastic, in which case the manager might not have any training to implement. But grain of salt to take with self-evaluation is typically, but particularly in the situation where an individual is invited to report to their direct superior about their performance, employees will tend to upsell and oversell their performance. They'll typically describe themselves as being particularly efficient and effective. They'll typically overlook some of the minor inconsistencies or areas for improvement in their own performance that they don't think are particularly valuable. So, as far as self-evaluation is concerned, one of the key features to make it work and not just a redundant exercise in self-promotion is that managers have to keep ongoing documentation so that patterns can be identified, particularly where employees continually report that they're exceeding set targets. Perhaps looking at their sales data over time will help identify if that is true. And if it's true, it's perhaps that employee needs to be rewarded in some way. Perhaps they're coming up for career advancement, or a career advancement opportunity exists and that employee is the first candidate you put forward for that opportunity. But certainly where employees are perhaps a bit self-deluded or being a little bit more self-promotional rather than realistic, you can identify if that's the case and implement corrective action at that time. Finally, employee observation is where an employee's performance is evaluated by watching them in action. One of the key features that makes employee observation worth doing is that it has to be done regularly. If you're only doing it once a year or even less frequently, you might catch someone on a good or a bad day and get a heavily skewed perception of that person's performance. In the case that you did that, it would be almost worthless because you don't evaluate your employees based on what they can do at their best or what they do at their worst. You want to evaluate them on their ongoing impact in your business. One common strategy for employee observation is the 360-degree feedback model, where a manager might observe an employee, but the manager will also seek reports from stakeholders that interact with this employee also. So perhaps the employee's peers, people that work on the same level. Perhaps this employee has a line manager or a manager who's directly involved with that employee, and you might get a report from that manager also. Perhaps this employee is customer facing and deals with customers, in which case the manager conducting the employee observation might seek feedback from the customers on their perception of this employee also. And when you collate all of that evidence, all of that data, you're more likely to get a well-rounded and well-informed perception of this employee's impact in your business. Certainly, you might find that their peers regard them as being very effective and the manager's very impressed, but in fact, customers find them a bit cold and a bit rude and a bit hard to deal with, in which case you might implement corrective action like investment in sales training to help that employee better achieve personal objectives with the ultimate goal of being to drive the business towards increased sales, increased market share, increased profit, increased fulfillment of shareholder expectations. In summary for this key knowledge point, it's important that performance management strategies are implemented and conducted fairly. Employees should always be clear about their objectives, what it is that those employees are going to be expected to achieve. And certainly, evaluations should be conducted regularly and indiscriminately to help identify, both from a business perspective and for the individual employees, self-awareness, whether or not that employee is working towards the achievement of their personal objectives. Definitely, feedback should be based on performance, and employees should be always given opportunities to improve their performance. That's why we say corrective action should be taken. If employees can do with correction in the way they work, then we should give them the opportunity to take corrective action. Certainly, for every business, a culture, an ongoing culture, or rather a culture of ongoing development and training, and a culture in which fair evaluations are just part of the framework, will help engage and motivate employees. If your employees are regularly gaining feedback on their performance, if when they're found to be lacking, they're given opportunities to improve their performance that don't come with embarrassment or shame, it's just part of the culture that people are constantly working to achieve their full potential and they're working to improve themselves, then your employees are going to be so engaged and motivated. And when your employees are engaged and motivated, they're more productive and efficient. That's all for today. See you next time.